Hey, everybody. This is a live edition of Theory of Change, and I'm joined by Charlie Sykes today. Hey, Charlie. Good to
Good
have
to
you.
be with you. Good to be
Yeah.
with you, Matthew.
Yeah. So today's topic that we are going to be discussing is what I'm calling the Great Republican Free Speech Hoax. And it is something that has been going on for many decades now. And both you and I came out of the world of right wing media. And so we're going to get a little bit inside baseball today in a way that you don't typically get to do on MSNBC or other places, I think. Right. But I want to go behind the curtain a bit because one of the key points about Trumpism and the far right tradition of reactionism that he comes out of is that they also lied to people like you and me. Like just as much as the voters, who will vote for Trump and have no idea what he stands for. They also lied to the talk show hosts like you and the conservative bloggers, former conservative bloggers like me. That's your cue to go off.
Well, you know what? I've been thinking a lot about, the argument that you will sometimes hear that Trumpism is somehow a logical extension of American conservatism, which of course is not. It is a radical break. It is not conservative in any sense. It is in fact a radical right wing ideology. But to your point, for years, and it really peaked, I think, in the last couple of years. Republicans and the MAGA world, you know, donned the cloak of being free speech absolutists, that they were the champions of it. Now, this was a reaction, I think, to some of the excesses that we saw during in recent years, particularly on university campuses. And one of the through lines, even though, I describe myself as a conservative, one of the through lines of a lot of what I did and what you did as well was to try to revivify classical liberalism. Classical liberalism that was, deeply invested in academic freedom and free speech. I was never totally certain how deep that ran in the Republican Party, but as I think the left became more comfortable with speech codes, trigger warnings, safe spaces, cancel culture, you did see this kind of coalescing of conservatives or people who considered themselves conservatives around free speech. And you had people, the absolutists like Elon Musk, who decided that this was going to be the banner that they were going to, go into the 2024 election with. That I think has been exposed as a complete and total hoax. It is
Oh,
one of the biggest bait and switches ever. Doesn't mean there are not still principled conservatives who are part of that classical liberal tradition, but people like Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance have completely abandoned that. And I know we're getting ahead of ourselves, but they have embraced a rather rank illiberalism. And I think you and I have talked about this before. There have been illiberal attacks on free speech from the left and from the right, but right now, you are seeing the most aggressive, illiberal use of state power to suppress speech that we have seen in decades, if ever, in this country.
yeah. I mean, I would say that the closest, analog that we've had was the Japanese internment. And Trump wants to go to that. And he's saying he wants to lock up people who he accuses of being part of Antifa, quote unquote. But Antifa doesn't exist. It's not an organization. Nobody can get like if you want. No one can give them money. It's literally not possible to give Antifa money because they're anarchists. You cannot have an organization of anarchists. And
Yes.
Antifa hates the Democrats. So the idea that the Democrats are somehow setting up this little puppet of Antifa super soldiers, like it's just complete garbage, and it's an obvious lie. But
Well, it's
but they don't
convenient for
want
them.
you to think that through.
Yeah, well, it's convenient for them, to take some of the protesters, and obviously there's a certain symbolism about Portland. There is no such thing as an organized Antifa, but there are people who go under that banner, and they'll often wear masks, and they will behave badly. But what Trump has done is he has inflated them because he needs an enemy, right? He
Yeah.
needs a foil. He needs a pretext for the deployment of troops and for the suppression of various kinds of speech. And so this has become his pretext. If that doesn't work, he will simply shift to some other target because, again, it's all a pretext. So it may be Antifa today, it will be somebody else tomorrow, but it's all a pretext to go after George Soros, to go after other critics, and to declare various kinds of emergencies that give him super presidential powers. Which, by the way, speaking of non-conservative, I mean, are you old enough to remember when conservatives were in favor of small government?
Huh.
Then they emphasized constitutional protections, and it was all about individual liberty. And the Second Amendment was all about people being able to resist tyranny. And now it's like, bring it on. Bring on the super state. Bring on the
Yeah.
dictator for one day or one term. It's a tremendous abandonment of everything they said they were for 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And and I think we do in historical accuracy, standpoint that this tradition, it was always there. Some of these people were into authoritarianism from the very beginning, including, William F. Buckley in his early years.
In the
He
beginning.
wrote a book explicitly saying, look, there should be no free speech on college campuses.
Yes. God
And
and man and Yale.
professors, yeah, God a man and yeah, and that professors who don't believe in Jesus should be fired, and professors who are atheists or professors who are Jewish and want to, and he wasn't even saying that they were promulgating their specific beliefs. He was just saying they don't believe in the resurrection, and so they need to be fired. Like that was, and then he wrote a book, defending Joe McCarthy and saying he was great, and that you should leave him alone. Like it was in many ways, Buckley was kind of the with McCarthy, he was like an anti McCarthy. That's
Yes, he
essentially
was.
what he was doing. And a lot of people, it wasn't just him like that. This whole idea of Dwight Eisenhower as a communist, and that we have to stop him. Like that was a very big thing. And, the whole paranoia about United Nations, which Trump, of course, is buying into as well.
Right.
So that stuff was always there. And I'm curious though, from your personal experience, as a former conservative talk show host, like how often did you see that facet of this authoritarian reactionism when your callers and the people that you
Yeah.
dealt with?
Well, it was always there, and you're right. And I've described this as the recessive gene in conservatism, that it was, always there beneath the surface. And you can go back even further than that. So
Yeah,
I would encounter it, although, the part of, the conservative movement that I was part of was, I think, more aligned with classical liberalism. So let's talk about, I want to go back to your comments about Buckley, because you're absolutely right. Buckley grew. He went through evolutions on race, on speech, on a variety of things. And eventually, a decade after he's defending Joe McCarthy, he plays a crucial role in expelling and excommunicating some of the far right, to some of the John Birch Society, the Robert Welch's, the KKK, the anti-Semites, etc. He also played a significant role in exiling, at least temporarily, people like Pat Buchanan from the conservative movement because of their anti-Semitism. But as you point out, there's a long tradition of this in American culture. In fact, we can go back. You were mentioning McCarthy era as one of the worst eras. Keep in mind that Joe McCarthy was not the president of the United States. We talked about this is the worst since McCarthy. Well, let's talk about that because Dwight Eisenhower was the president, not Joe McCarthy. Imagine Joe McCarthy with the power of the presidency, the power of the FBI, the power of the Department of Justice. What the country would have looked like. We'd gone through a previous Red Scare, believe it or not, under Woodrow Wilson. People have kind of forgotten about that American nightmare, where we had
yeah,
the Palmer raids, where we had um, an extremely weaponized Department of Justice that went out and suppressed free speech, particularly socialist speech, in some of the most aggressive ways. For some reason, that's all been
yeah,
memory hold. But I always think, going back with your question, there was always a push and pull on the right, where some of the people, and again, you're seeing the same thing right now, where you have this sort of nationalist, nativist right versus what I thought was the ascendant part of conservatism. And this is what I got wrong. I thought the reformist wing of the party that embraced classical liberalism, that embraced free speech, academic freedom, um, inclusiveness was in fact the future of the party. You look back on that now, and it was clearly a delusion. Donald Trump and MAGA decided that no, that's a dead end. We're going to go with blood and soil. And blood and soil also means that we're going to use the state to shape the culture in our own image, as opposed to what conservatives had argued for a half a century, that government has a very limited role. And what's crucial about small government is that the smaller government is, the greater the sphere for individual freedom. The larger government was, the more that sphere of individual freedom is shrunken. Well, look at Trump and JD Vance and the FCC right now. They are expanding government power into virtually every corner of American life and culture, which again is so diametrically opposed to what we were told conservatism was back in, well, again, from, since the end of World War II.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it was, and this idea though, like, so you have these two ideologies, conservatism and reactionism. And a lot of people, I think, don't understand that that these are different things. And from a historical standpoint, the analog is looking at the Soviet Union and liberalism. So with McCarthy, both he was saying that everyone who was a liberal was a communist,
Right.
but also the communists were saying that they were just good liberals. And
Liberals in
so
a hurry, right?
liberals in a hurry. Yeah, that was their catchphrase. And and that was this phenomenon of extremist groups trying to label themselves as part of a mainstream nonviolent, free speech associated movement. This is called entryism in political science, where that's what they do, is that they wrap, and this happens across the world, across ideologies. This also happens in Islamic dominated countries where Islamism is an ideology which says there should be no democracy, there should only be religious
Right.
authoritarianism, and but I'm just a regular Muslim. And so like this happens over and over, and that's what the key to Trump's continued support is, that he's lied to conservatives and told them, I'm one of you. But he isn't. He is a reactionary authoritarian, who, as you said, wants a gigantic government, and he literally is taking pieces of private businesses like Intel,
Mhm.
and and doing everything that they said Joe Biden was a tyrant for. Donald Trump is doing it. And then the same thing with, like all of these conspiracies like of Alex Jones about all the globalists are taking over the world. They're trying to get rid of American sovereignty. Well, you know what? There are people that are doing it. And it's people like Peter Thiel. It's people like Balaji Srinivasan. It's like, these tech oligarchs, they're the ones that are doing it. And the same thing with the NRA, and the government's coming after you, wants to round you up as a citizen. Well, yeah, they are. And it's your side that's doing it. Like
Well,
that's what they tell you.
well, I radically agree with you. And I think this is an important point for progressives to realize, because, and again, I am frustrated with the people who are saying that there is this straight line through all conservatism, that, that if you supported Mitt Romney and supported John McCain or any of the Bushes or Ronald Reagan, that you created Donald Trump. This plays into the Trumpian hands, because it normalizes what's happening now. It says that it's just a continuation, that it's just the same old, same old. And I think you and I are arguing here. I think this is very, very important. That it is a big mistake to think this is same old, or that this is normal, or that this is a continuum. It is a very radical break. Now, again, there were these recessive genes; they were always there, but it was not the whole story. And I think the distinctions that are so important. It is important to make a distinction between, say, Hubert Humphrey and Che Guevara. It is very important to make a distinction between, and again, I'm dating myself, between, an ACLU liberal, and Trotskyites. They may be all on the left, And to the right, they all look alike. Well, the left is in many ways making the same mistake. They look at the right and they think, well, all of you people have the same, essentially, have the same ideological roots. That is not true. And by the way, and this is related to it, but maybe it will sound like a digression. Here's another thing that frustrates me is that Donald Trump and MAGA will often wrap themselves in the cloak of conservatism. And you're right. They've told people go along with all of this because for years you considered yourself a Republican and a conservative. See what we're doing in your name. Now, a lot of us are saying no, that's not what we're doing. But think about the whole doctrine of constitutional originalism that they're constantly talking about to justify many of the things that they're doing. I don't know about you, but I've spent time going back and reading the Federalist Papers and reading about what the founding fathers were thinking and what they were doing. And you know what is not originalist? What Donald Trump is doing right now. The original focus of that Constitution was to prevent tyrants. They were obsessed with blocking tyrants, limiting tyrants, keeping tyrants out of office, and then constraining their power if anybody became tyrant adjacent. This was the fundamental original of originalism. And yet, somehow, you have a lot of people who are going into the ballot box, voting for Donald Trump, telling the pollsters they support what Donald Trump is doing, but they would consider themselves constitutional conservatives. I mean, I think we need to call bullshit on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another thing that they've also done that is, a key lie for them is that they equate private actors with government actors. So if somebody is on, is criticizing, so if a bunch of private citizens are criticizing, somebody for doing something racist or doing something, sexually harassing somebody, that's not the government. That's not a violation of free speech. If a whole bunch of people say you're a jerk and you did something awful, I don't like you. That's not censorship. That's somebody saying that these are private citizens in using their free speech. Like that's the difference between what Donald Trump is doing with scientists. I mean, he literally issued a list of prohibited words to scientists. Words that have nothing to do with politically correct terms. Like they flagged scientists who use the word woman. Like and that's the difference. Like they want you to think that this is the same. Like they just do this over and over and over. That they equate everything and try to muddy the waters and trick people who don't pay attention.
Okay, I want to agree with you and disagree in part. Okay, I want to agree that it is a crucial distinction: private actors versus government actors. There's a reason why we treat them differently. I mean, first of all, the Constitution treats them differently because government power is so great, because government power is coercive, because the government can take away your freedom and your life and can destroy you. Um, so that's why the First Amendment says that private individuals can engage in the suppression of speech, but the government cannot. Now, having said that, the distinction is important. I do think that the cancel culture that existed for the last decade or so was primarily private actors, but it was an attack on free speech. It was not an attack on the First Amendment, and there's a slight distinction. And the attack on free speech, I think, served to hollow out the support for the values that you and I are talking about here. I'm watching this juggernaut attacking free expression and the lack of effective pushback. And I'm afraid that what happened was there was a pincer movement from the illiberal left and the illiberal right, basically saying, yeah, we think it's okay to suppress speech. Let's equate speech with violence. Let's say that words make me feel unsafe. Let's say that there are certain things that mean that you should be driven out of polite society or lose your job for. And I think there has been a sense that we're actually in favor of censorship of the ideas we don't like. And so when the right comes in and says, well, you folks on the left have been saying the speech you don't like is violent, we're going to do the same thing. So I think this is where we kind of need to step back and go, we need to have this relearning of what liberal tolerance is about. Again, the distinction between government and private is absolutely essential. But on the other hand, there is a connective tissue there that if you become intolerant of ideas that you don't like, don't be surprised when it leaches out the way it is now into government action. Are you following me? I'm because these distinctions I think are very, very important. I mean, let me tell you what I'm thinking about. A few years ago, do you remember that Harper's letter? You had a lot of center right, center left writers write a letter talking about, hey, we ought to have vigorous debate in this country. We ought to have free speech. We ought not to destroy people's lives because of what they say. There was tremendous blowback against that declaration of free speech, almost all of it from the left, from the identitarian left. So that now I do think that they they have eroded some of those values that's made it easier for what Trump is doing with government. And I'm sorry to have gone on for so long.
Oh, no, that's all right. I mean, yeah, there is something there that I agree with for sure, and I think but I don't think I agree with everything, but what I would say is that the idea that uh, I would like the left to go to learn from how same-sex marriage became the law of the land,
Hmm.
and people were voting for it because that was a movement that, and I know a lot of the people that were involved with it, that
Hmm.
they were saying, look, we are going to make all the arguments for what we want and what we believe is morally right, including arguments that are not morally based at all. So we'll make practical arguments, we will make legal arguments, we will make pragmatic arguments about, in terms of family, so they just offered all possible arguments, including religious arguments, because in fact, there's a strong case
Yep.
for religious viewpoint of same-sex marriage, and they won by doing that. And there's so after that, though, people did not pay attention to how that movement won. And instead, they said, well, we're just going to only make moral arguments about our subsequent beliefs. So whether, it was things like, transgender rights, which I support 100%. But like, you can't bully people into supporting a position that they don't understand. So, but if you can phrase it in a way that is saying, look, from your standpoint, this makes sense and it doesn't hurt you, because, the reality is, the percentage of people who are trans in the world is way less than 1%. So, and Charlie Baker, the NCAA president, said, look, there were fewer than 10 trans athletes in the entire NCAA. This is more than 550,000 people. Less than 10 of them are trans. So this is not a thing to get upset about. If you have people that are trans in sports, like, it's a distraction. That's what it is. And but we have to be able to make these arguments that don't require people to, because we have to be able to separate between the reason for wanting something and wanting something. And people should be able to agree with you for a different reason. And I think that was the flaw of the pre-Trump left, if you will.
Well, yeah, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of talking about the trans issue in any depth, but there was this attempt to impose this orthodoxy that you must believe all of these things, otherwise, you were going to be cast into outer darkness. And I think that backfired badly. That rather than having an open discussion about it, they tried to shut it down, and I don't think it's working. So let me take the conversation in a slightly different direction. And I know that you and I have had this conversation before, and I was thinking about the question you asked about when I was back in conservative media, did I see some of these other trends out there? And the answer is that, yeah, I remember in the before times that there was the stream of the Christian right that felt like it was from a completely different intellectual tradition than the one that I thought was becoming dominant in conservatism. By the way, I was wrong about that, obviously. And I mean, I remember having discussions where I was very much taken aback by the sort of latent authoritarianism on the part of many people who clearly did not like the idea of a separation of church and state, would deny that it actually even existed or that it should exist. I remember a caller, I can't even remember what decade it was, who I was kind of challenging him. I said, "So, do you think that schools should have prayer in school?" Yes, he did. I said, "Which prayers?" Well, good, the good prayers. I said, okay, would it be appropriate for a public school to require students to say the Hail Mary every single day? And he said, "Yes, I think that that would be a really, really good idea." And I'm thinking, okay, well, wait, we are a long way from sort of, I think, the general consensus opinion on all of this. But there were people out there who took a very, very different view. The other area that I always found kind of disturbing, and I wish we could spend more time on this. There was always, look, I mean, we have a very complicated history in this country, including in places like Wisconsin, about race. And there were latent attitudes, particularly about immigrants and about other issues. And every once in a while, that would break through, and somebody would say something that was, egregiously bigoted. Back in the before times, you could push back against that. And if you listen to, whatever you think about George W. Bush or Mitt Romney or John McCain, they did throughout their careers would say, wait, 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 wait. This is not who we are. We're not going to engage in that kind of racism or bigotry. We need to appeal to our better angels. And for a long time, I felt, and I'm not sure I was totally wrong about this, that when you did that, people would go, okay, okay, that was sort of in the back of my mind, or that's what my uncle might say, but yeah, I don't want to be that person. Let's think about this differently. So there was an alternative path for conservatism when you had leaders who were morally based. And again, whatever you think about their politics, remember how George W. Bush handled the question of anti-Muslim bigotry after 9/11? You remember how John McCain pushed back against somebody at a rally who said that, he ought to, accuse Barack Obama of being a Muslim terrorist or something. Those voices are gone. So now what you have is you have people like Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and JD Vance and others who are egging on the worst impulses. They are giving permission to people to indulge in the kinds of, I don't hate is that we thought that we had exiled from the movement. And this is the other big lie. I mean, I think of all of the efforts for years that people had to clean up right wing politics or conservative politics. And the Trump era has just completely blown that up. So again, I get frustrated with the people who say, well, you've always been racist. I mean, look at what Buckley wrote back in the 1950s. True. Look at the Southern strategy. True. Look at various other things. All of that was there. But I thought that the arc could have been bent the other way. Clearly, it didn't. Maybe I was wrong, but it's not a straight line continuum.
Yeah, it isn't. And yeah, that's a great point. And and I personally also encountered that in as a conservative blogger that I
Hmm.
had colleagues that they would write posts saying that they would get mad at CBS for having a character that was a lesbian
Yeah.
on their show, and they would write that up. I would look at that and say, this is this is junk. Like I don't want
Yeah.
this on my site. Who cares if they have a lesbian character? Who cares if there's a gay couple on this show? Like if you don't like it, don't watch it. They're not doing anything to you by having these characters. And they're not saying, "Oh, you have to be gay." No, they're not saying that. They're saying gay people exist. And you know what? Leave them
Yeah.
alone. You don't have to support same-sex marriage, whatever. Their existence is not an oppression. And but they continue to have those opinions, and and I continued to see them, and that was it was a source of friction for me with some of my former colleagues because they didn't believe and they still don't, so I did see that it was like two strands that were always there, but even this idea of of this recessive Eugene, as you're calling it, or what I call the reactionary tradition, you know, it's the political operatives. They knew it was there, and they encouraged it a lot more.
They
Like, and I
exploited it. Yes, they did.
yeah, and I think that that's something also that a lot of people on the center to left don't quite understand is that people like you and I, we were also duped, that people lied to us about what they were doing and who they were courting. Because while they might have, while a lot of them, would publicly say, "Oh, well, I don't want this racism stuff," they would also want them to vote for them. Like they would, or they might say, "Well, don't say the Christian nationalist stuff in public, but make sure to vote for me." And like so, it was like they created this
Well,
Frankenstein monster in a lot of ways,
well,
and they didn't let us know that they were doing it. And we didn't know, we had no idea.
well, in fairness, okay, I would like to agree with you on that, but
Hmm.
I think at some level we did or I did, you knew that it was going on.
Hmm.
Because, but I mean, again, I mean, I can go back and find things that I wrote, it's like, we need to fight against these people. We need to, distance ourselves from these people. We can't be the party of idiots anymore. I did a cover story for a public policy magazine before Trump saying, we need to get rid of the crackpots and everything. But I think part of what was going on though, I'm, you know, I, I wish I could say they all lied about it, but I think that a lot of us simply made that sort of, let's look the other way. Let's look the
Hmm.
other way because this is the coalition. And we needed the coalition. We needed all of those votes. So there was a little bit of wink wink. I mean, I remember going to certain meetings and there'd be some crazy person. I mean, just out all off the wall. And it was like, okay, what am I going to do about that person? Am I going to throw them out of the room? Or, they're going to end up voting for, you know, the candidates that I was supporting. So I think that there was a moral failing on the part of people like me that we knew that it was going on, and yet, thinking that this is just part of, this is the way it works. I mean, the Southern strategy was not a secret. Some of the stuff that some of the stuff. I mean, so who is the Bush fixer? I'm forgetting his name with
Leah Water.
the Leah, we kind of knew what the Leah Waters were up to, and it was like the game playing. And this is something I worry about in politics today and in the media, which I call the hackification of the media, is that we have too many political operatives and too many political consultants who we now treat like somehow as if they are legitimate journalists or pundits. And the reaction is these are hired guns. These are people who basically you bring in, you give them the money, when you go out and say, get the job done. And I don't really want to know how dirty it is. I don't really want to know all the stuff that you do. And so I think that unfortunately, there's not a real distinction between the people who are sitting around thinking, what is right, what is wrong, what do we believe, what do we not believe, and that we've ceded a lot of that to what works, what is effective, what moves the dial. Um, how can I raise more money off this outrage? But yes, for years and years and years, I think politicians, Republican politicians, pretended to be one thing while exploiting something that was below them, and then were very, very surprised that what was below them was uncontrollable. The analogy that I've used is: imagine you've been growing a baby alligator in your bathtub for years, and then suddenly you're really, really surprised that it got big and it's crawled out of the bathtub and it's going down the street and it's eating people. It was your alligator. You should have known, right? But you know,
Hmm.
you are somewhat responsible for the baby alligator.
Well, yeah, that's and definitely a true point. And like Bush, when he was going against John McCain, his
As should.
people put out a false rumor that John McCain had a black child out of wedlock.
Yeah,
And of course they denied that it was them, but
yeah,
it was them.
yeah. But it was. Yeah.
And so yeah, so like there was this continuous operation, and the same thing. I remember also seeing some of this Christian nationalism that for me, because I left this world before Trump. And it was a lot harder, I'll tell you, because there was no infrastructure out there saying, look at what's happening to the Republican Party. Nobody wanted to pursue that story when I was trying to tell them about it. But like I remember watching Tony Perkins, the head of the American Family or whatever it is, um, and he was saying, that Christians who believe in same-sex marriage, they don't deserve religious liberty because it's just fake. It's fake. They're lying. They're not real Christians. And so if they want the religious right to perform same-sex weddings, well, they shouldn't have it because they're not having a traditional belief. So therefore, they to get no religious liberty. And I
I
remember
thought
seeing it.
these guys were marginalized. See, this was my mistake, and I think a lot of our mistake. We thought those voices were on the fringes and were marginalized. It turns out, well, they certainly are no longer. Look, people like that. Now they're at the table.
Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And so like up for most of my career as a conservative operative and commentator, I didn't really pay attention to these people because I thought, well, they're dumb, their arguments are crap, and who cares, whatever. But eventually I realized, oh gosh, these people actually, comprise the plurality of the voters, and it isn't, but
Publican
it's
vote.
also that the conservative a lot of them became more radicalized because they were lied to, because so many people who are religious conservatives, they don't understand that just because people don't agree with you doesn't mean that you are going to be criminalized, and that narrative of the criminalization of Christianity, like they really have sold that to people and they want them, so it's been very, very effective to them that just because,
Well, yeah.
they tell you that disagreement is oppression. Well, it's not.
Well, and very, very effectively, what MAGA has done is it has really played the victim card. And again, this is very, very, convinced their supporters, and particularly Christians, that they are persecuted, they're coming for you, and you are the victim. The irony is, and this was, I'm dating myself, of course, is that back in the early 1990s, I wrote a book called A Nation of Victims, this new culture that everybody wanted to be a victim because it gave you political clout, provided a certain amount of innocence. But I never imagined that conservative Republicans would embrace that culture of victimization as aggressively as they have, or frankly, as effectively as they have. In fact, if you listen to Donald Trump, and he has done this very, very effectively, when he was being charged criminally, all those indictments, he would say, they're not coming after me, they're coming after you, or they're coming after me because they want to get you. And
And I'm in the way.
identify, I am in the way, and in the on the Christian right, this sense that you're talking about, that that they are somehow under siege all the time, is critical to understand their radicalization and their politics. It's also important to understand why they're willing to tolerate so many things that seem so aggressively unchristian, which is they're basically saying, we're huddled in the basement, they're kicking down the doors, we can't afford to have qualms about these other things. And they've convinced these people, in the absence of any evidence, that in fact that's going on.
They have, and they've just completely turned around the ideas of Jesus saying that my kingdom is not of this world. So,
Oh my God.
the entire point of what he was saying was, look, most people will disagree with you. Most people won't like you. The government isn't going to implement your ideas. And you should be okay with that because that's not what you're here for. You're not here to put your values into the law. You're here to be a good person and to do good works. That's the point of what this is. But they've switched it. They've completely inverted it and said, no, my identity is what matters. And you know, and that was always one thing that I always thought was interesting when Trump was very first coming along in the Republican primaries in 2015, 2016. Now, I predicted in 2015 that he would win the
Did
primaries.
you?
Everybody thought I was nuts. But I was right. And
I
but
mean,
one of the things that I noticed was that the people who were the most supportive of Trump in the beginning were the self-identified Christians who never went to church. And
yes,
I thought
yes, yes.
that's really what has kind of become because it makes sense. Trump himself, of course, doesn't go to church, doesn't know anything about Christianity, doesn't know anything about the
Nothing.
Bible. It's
And it
all
doesn't
about
seem to
identity.
bother them.
No, because it's
So,
about power.
so for to underline your point about the complete switching about what Jesus said about government, it is interesting watching these right-wing evangelical Christians now embrace what's being called red Caesarism, that they want their own Caesar, but as long as he is the red Caesar, they're all in favor of it. And I think that once you begin to understand that, you also understand, again, going back to our original theme, the radical break from values that used to be taken for granted, or at least I thought used to be taken for granted, or maybe, had been, in a subterranean way, or maybe you and I had simply, you less than me, I mean, because you paid attention to all of this. Um, we're always sort of there and latent, sort of like a chronic disease. So this is not going to go away when Donald Trump leaves the scene. We won't have a cult of personality necessarily, but things have been unleashed in our culture and in our politics that are not going away anytime soon because they have some pretty deep roots. But again, please, for the listeners of this discussion, don't make the mistake. Don't buy the MAGA line that this is normal conservatism. Do not buy Trump's bait and switch that somehow what he is doing is a continuation of of legitimate reformist conservatism because it's not.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, I think you have a hard out here in the next couple of minutes. So thanks for being here. So for give some tell us what you're doing real quick, or anything you want to promote here before we head out.
Well, like you, I'm on Substack, putting most of my energy into independent media these days. So if you have a chance to subscribe to the Contrary newsletter and the To the Contrary podcast, we have been putting out a newsletter pretty much every single day, trying to remind everyone that we are not the crazy ones, even though it does feel like the world's losing its mind.
All right. Yes. Yeah, absolutely true. All right. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for being here, Charlie. Good to see you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Anytime.
All right. Thanks everybody for watching. Yeah.